this country.
Damien Collins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. This is an incredibly important bill. It has huge cross-party support. It was subject to the scrutiny of the Joint Committee, which produced a unanimous report, which I think shows the widespread feeling in both houses and on both sides of this chamber as well that we do legislate. I do feel, though, sort of, with regards to the Joint Committee report, I should respond to some of the remarks made by the Shadow Secretary of State in her speech. I agree with her that unless this legislation covers the systems of social media companies as well as the content it hosts, that it will not be effective. But it is my belief that it does do that. And I think throughout the process of the committee taking evidence, including from Ofcom, not just from the government, it was stated to us very clearly that the systems of social media companies are within scope. That Ofcom, when preparing the risk registers for the companies, can look at risks, which could include for Facebook the fact that the newsfeed recommends content to users, or when someone goes on TikTok and uses For You, that the company is selecting, algorithmically ranking content that someone might like. And that could include for a teenage girl content that promotes self-harm and being actively recommended by the systems of the company, or as Frances Haugen set out, extremist content and hate speech being actively promoted and recommended by the systems. That would be in scope. The algorithms are within scope. And I think part of the job of Parliament on an ongoing basis will be to ensure that Ofcom is using the powers that it has to audit the companies in that way, to gain access to information in that way, and to say that the active promotion of regulated content by a social media company is an offence, and that we expect in this bill being passed that will be fully in scope. If what we have is a piece of legislation where an individual piece of content is judged whether it should be there or not, that is taken down. There's no obligation of the company to proactively identify any copies of that content. We'd have a very ineffective system. We'd have, in effect, what Facebook has today, the way Facebook assesses content today. Yeah, and if that was effective, then we wouldn't need this legislation. But it's woefully ineffective. So the algorithms and the systems are in scope. The bill gives Ofcom the power to regulate on that basis, and we have to make sure that they do in preparing the risk registers. On the codes of practice, following my committee colleague, the member for Bristol North East, the point on the codes of practice is really important. That the regulator sets the codes of practice for the companies to follow. In the government's response to the Joint Committee report, the government set out that the regulator can tell companies if their response is not adequate. If an area of risk has been identified where the company has to create policies to address that risk, and if it's not good enough, then the regulator can still find the company within breach. I'd welcome if the Minister wishes to say more at that either today or see the bill goes through the House. But it is really, really important. The response of a company can't be to a request from the regulator that has identified risk on their platform to say that, well, sorry, we don't have a policy on that. They have to be able to set those policies. We have to go beyond just enforcing the terms of service the companies have created for themselves. Making sure they do what they say they're going to do, as the Secretary of State said, is really important. But we should have the ability to push them to go further. I agree with the Honourable Lady and with other members on regulation being based on risk, not just on size. And I think in reality that Ofcom will have to make judgment calls on smaller sites that are posing a huge risk. A new risk has been identified and it will have to do that. The regulator will have the power to regulate metaverse and VR platforms. Anything that is a user-to-user service is already within scope of the legislation. The challenge with the regulator will be, I think, to ensure that how you moderate a conversation between two people in a virtual room as opposed to textual-based content they're posting is much harder, and the technology will have to adapt to do that. But we should start that journey based on the fact that it is already within scope. Finally, I would say on the much-used expression legal but harmful, I'm pleased that the government took one of our big recommendations, which is to write more offences clearly onto the face of the bill, so it's clear what is actually being regulated. So promotion of self-harm is regulated content. Hate speech is part of the regulated content. The job of the regulator then is to set the threshold where intervention should come, and I think that should be based on case law. Many of these issues, like the abuse of the England footballers after the final of the European Championships, people have been sentenced in courts for what they did. That creates a good guidance and a good baseline for what hate speech is in that context, where we would expect intervention. I do think it would be much easier for the bill and for people, the service users that are regulated and people that post content, to know what the offences are and where the regulatory standard is. And I think rather than describing those things as legal but harmful, we should describe them what they are, which is regulated offences based on existing offences in law. The government, I think, made an important step in responding as well to say that the Secretary of State in seeking, or the government seeking amendment to the codes of practice or to bring new offences within scope of these priority areas of harm, she'd have to go through an affirmative process in both houses, and that is really important. I think ultimately the regulations should be based on our laws and changes should be based on decisions taken in this House.
After the next speaker, the time limit will be reduced to 4 minutes.